A little bit low in number tonight, which kind of expected that with some of the crazy COVID-ness that we're having to go through. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. You probably have received the notation about our postponing some of our services for a while, and we'll talk more about that at the end of this lesson. So let's take our Bibles and turn to the book of Acts, Acts chapter 20. Well, we're going to be about in chapter 23, but I'm going to walk us through some of the things that we've studied in the past, and then we'll get to some new information around chapter 23. Acts chapter 23, life of Paul. We're in that section of his life that I've given the title, The Prison Years in Jerusalem and Caesarea. So we have 2 years of imprisonment that sometimes I think in the life of Paul we forget. I thought everything looked a little blurry. What did I do with my glasses? Well, I can read it. Look in your office? Yeah, look in my office or on that counter right inside the office. What was I talking about? Prison years in Jerusalem, Caesarea, life of Paul, 2 years. So let's look at first slide. Let's do a little review here and remember what we were doing. So Paul arrives in Jerusalem, Acts chapter 21 and verse 17, at the end of his third missionary journey. First, second, third missionary journey. He had been at Ephesus, and he had gone back to Corinth, and then he made it back to Jerusalem, and he arrives there around, we think, the day of Pentecost. The day of Pentecost. Now he delivers that offering, the offering that he had been collecting from the Macedonians, from the Corinthians, from many others. Do you find them for me? Thank you very much. Maybe I can see now. Thank you. Oh yeah, it looks a lot better. So he delivered his offering. That he tells us about that in chapter 24, verse 17. That's in our lesson tonight. And the brethren received him gladly. That would be the Jerusalem church. They received him gladly. They rejoiced partially over the Jews being saved. Didn't seem to be as happy about the Gentiles being saved. And they talked to Paul about still some misunderstanding of what Paul was talking about when he said it's not outward circumcision, but circumcision of the heart. It's not in the letter, but in the spirit. And people were saying, Paul, you're telling the Jews not to circumcise their children, and you're telling them not to keep the customs of the Jews. Well, we talked about what Paul did preach and teach. But they encouraged, advised, actually I should say insisted, that Paul would convince the Jews that he was still a good Jew. Now, go ahead and go to the next slide. Yes, thank you. Paul says this about his teaching in regards to the law. He says in Acts 24, verse 14, "But this I confess to you, that according to the way," when Jesus said, "I am the way, the truth, and the life," another name for Christianity, the way of Jesus Christ, is the way. So he says that according to the way, which they call a sect, which is another way of saying they call it a cult, "so I worship the God of my fathers, believing all things which are written in the law and in the prophets." So Paul was the one who wrote, it is good to use the law if one uses it lawfully. So it is not that the law is bad, it's the bad interpretation of the law. And Paul was definitely the one who was trying to straighten all that out. And he got a bad name for that. So they said, here's what you're going to do, Paul. He says, James is telling him this, the elders of the church are telling him this, and he says, what you're going to do is you're going to go through a purification ritual. You're going to pay the expenses of 4 men who have to go through, complete a vow, and you're going to prove to the Jews that you still walk orderly, and keep the law. We can talk back and forth about why Paul may or may not have done that. In my own opinion, I think he did that in an effort to have an audience with the Jews so that he might save some of his brethren, in the sense of share the gospel with them and convince them of the truth of the gospel, that in Paul's desire for the Jews to be saved never left him. Well, how did it all turn out? Paul was arrested. He was attacked, he was beaten, he was almost killed, and he was arrested. Paul addresses the Jewish mob in Jerusalem. In Acts chapter 22, we did that last time. And he explains who he is, how he was saved, how God had called him to minister to the Gentiles, and that's when it all exploded. I mean, they just went nuts. And the Roman dignitaries, the commander, Claudius Lysias, comes in, he grabs Paul. If he wouldn't have grabbed Paul, they would have torn him limb from limb. And he brings him into the barracks in Jerusalem, and that's where we left him last week. So Paul is under arrest. He is actually being held at a Roman army base. That's what the barracks are. And so we pick up at chapter 22 and verse 25. Acts 22 and verse 25. Not 21, 22. Verse 25. And as they bound him, Paul, with thongs, Paul said to the centurion who stood by him, "Is it lawful for you to scourge a man who is a Roman?" Hang on to that, because we're going to talk a little bit about Paul's use of his Roman citizenship and how the Roman government was protective of the Apostle Paul. Now, when the centurions heard that, they went and told the commander, Commander Lysias, and he said, "Take care what you do, for this man is a Roman." Romans had rights. And if they did him wrong, just as we as U.S. citizens, we have the right, if we are wrongfully abused by our government or our police or by any other citizen, we have the right to go to law for that. And so they said, you be careful here. This man is a Roman citizen. He said, "Are you a Roman?" The commander said to Paul, "Are you a Roman?" Verse 27, he said, "I am, yes." And he said, "Well, I had to pay for mine. How did you get yours?" Paul says, "I was born a Roman citizen," which means his father was a Roman citizen. And so Paul was born a Roman citizen, and so they then immediately, those who were about to examine him, and they were going to examine him by beating the phooey out of him. This is the examination by scourging. What does that mean? They beat somebody until they confess their crime. And so they were about to do that, and they withdrew from him. And the commander was also afraid, verse 29, and the commander also was afraid, and he, after he found out that he was a Roman, because he had bound him. So Commander Lysias had already broken the law. And so the next day, because he wanted to know for certain why he was accused by the Jews, he released him from his bonds and commanded the chief priests and all the council to appear, and brought Paul down and set him before them. So before we go there, let's catch up on some of our notes again. So we're at slide number 6. So Paul was rescued again by Commander Lysias. He appeals to his Roman citizenship. And then he is to appear before the great Sanhedrin. So here's where we are. In Acts 23, Paul is about to appear before the great Sanhedrin court of Jerusalem. It is what we would think of when I say Supreme Court among the Jews. They had a limited amount of authority under the Roman rulership, usually in matters of religion. And this is a by the way, if you take this event of the life of Paul and you compare it to the events of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ and how He was handled, it's very similar. There are a lot of similarities as to what happened. So we'll see some of those here in just a moment. But to say that the Sanhedrin could recommend, as they did with Jesus, that He be executed or whatever His punishment might be. Now, they had to convince the Romans that that was indeed something justifiable. And so we saw that with our Lord Jesus Christ. We're seeing it now. So now Paul was a smart fellow. He knew that he was not going to get a fair hearing with the Jews. So with the Jews, Paul was guilty until they proved him guilty, and never was innocence even in the conversation. So Paul knew when he stood before this Sanhedrin court that he was not going to get a fair hearing. So watch what he does. So Paul, looking earnestly, now that language right there, looking earnestly, is like he's staring a hole through their hearts. He was looking intently at them. And he said, "Men and brethren, I have lived in all good conscience before God until this day." And the high priest, I can't say that, Ananias, there we go. What did they do? Slapped him on the mouth. What happened to Jesus when He stood before the high priest? Slapped him on the mouth. Now, Paul wasn't some sissified wimp. He wasn't going to sit there and take that. Paul said, "God will strike you, you whitewashed wall. For you sit to judge me according to the law, and do you command me to be struck contrary to the law?" Well, we could go into the whole how people who stood before the Sanhedrin were to be treated. One thing where they were not to be abused. They were not to be abused. And so Paul was just slapped on the face. Well, then those who stood by says, "Do you revile God's high priest?" Now, Paul took that very seriously. He said, "Whoa, wait. I did not know, brethren, that this was the high priest. For it is written, you shall not speak evil of a ruler of your people." So this is sort of Paul's way of saying, "Oops, I'm sorry. I didn't know that you were the high priest." Now, here's where the wisdom of the Apostle Paul comes in play. But when Paul perceived that part were Sadducees and the other were Pharisees, he cried out to the council, "Men and brethren, I am a Pharisee, the son of a Pharisee. Concerning the hope of the resurrection of the dead, I am being judged." Now, I think a lot of you know who the Pharisees and the Sadducees are. I always think of the little kid song, "The Sadducees were sad, you see, because they didn't believe in the resurrection." They didn't believe in the resurrection. They didn't believe in miracles. They didn't believe in angels. They didn't believe in what we think of as heaven and hell. They were very philosophical, meaning earthly minded in their religion. It was all about what could be benefited on this earth. The Pharisees, on the other hand, were the more conservatives. They did believe in God. They did believe, well, of course, the Sadducees believed in God, but they did believe in the resurrection. They did believe in angels and demons and Satan and all of those things. And so when Paul says, "I am a Pharisee, and I have lived according to the hope and the resurrection of the dead," he says, "and that's why I'm being judged." And then verse 7, "And when he had said this," well, here's the argument. The Pharisees and the Sadducees began to argue. "For the Sadducees say there is no resurrection, no angel, nor spirit, but the Pharisees confess both. Then there arose a loud outcry, and the scribes and the Pharisees party arose and protested, saying, 'We find no evil in this man.'" So they were more concerned about winning the argument in the Sanhedrin than they were about convicting their enemy, the Apostle Paul. Now, as I understand, and I only understand this because I read books, that at this time, historically, in the Sanhedrin, there was a huge power struggle. We might think Democrats and Republicans, but it was who could control the Sanhedrin? Who had the most votes, the Sadducees or the Pharisees? They were not by any means friends. Now, they both were involved in the execution of our Lord, and they were both involved here in the attempt to execute the Apostle Paul. Paul pitted them against one another on doctrinal issues. And as a result, there was a loud outcry. And verse 10, now when there arose a great dissension, the commander, fearing lest Paul might be pulled to pieces by them, that might be how it happens in our nation's capital. I'm not sure. I know that back in the day, I have read that the representatives made sure that they had their sidearm when they went to the House for fear of experiencing bodily injury or another gun pointed at them. But the commander of the soldiers had to go down and take him by force and to bring him into the barracks. So what Paul did was basically cause an argument because he knew that this was going to come to nothing. In other words, there was no way he was going to win here. And so what he did is he simply fueled the fire of an ongoing argument. And notice in verse 11. In verse 11. This is where the Lord... can you imagine what Paul's going through right now? Can you imagine the confusion? What's going to happen to me? The Jews hate me. I'm not sure how the Romans are thinking of me, but the Lord said, what wonderful, wonderful encouragement and comfort. Be of good cheer, Paul. For as you have testified for me in Jerusalem, so you must also bear witness at Rome. We talked about that once before, but how is Paul bearing witness in Jerusalem? A prisoner, right? And so in the same manner, he would go to Rome and bear witness of the Lord as a prisoner. Sometimes we think that, if God would put us in a better situation, if God would remedy some of our hindering circumstances, that we could be a greater witness for the Lord. But oftentimes God puts us where we are at this time so that we can be the greatest witness that we ever could be at any other time or place. So no matter what condition we're in, no matter what circumstance we're in, we can witness for the Lord. And so that's what the Lord told Paul. Okay, where am I at on my notes? I'm at slide number 7. An oath to kill Paul. I'll summarize a little bit. So there were, what's the number, 40? There were 40 men. 40 men, verse 13. And they said, we will neither eat nor drink until we kill the Apostle Paul. I'm not sure if those guys starved or not, but they did not kill the Apostle Paul. I hate to give away the ending. But this does show the vehement anger that they had toward the Apostle Paul. They said, we're not going to eat or drink until we kill him. Here's where we meet some of Paul's family that lives in Jerusalem. His nephew. Some translations say his sister's son. So where am I at here? So their plan, the 40 men who took a vow of fasting until they kill Paul, their plan was they went to the commander and they said, Commander, we want you to, they told let me get it right here. They told the chief priest and the elders to go to the commander and say, we want to hear from Paul again. And what we will do is we will lie in wait And while they are transferring Paul from the barracks back to the Sanhedrin, we'll kill him. Now, only by the providence of God did Paul's sister's son, verse 16, hear about this, went to Paul, told Paul about it, and I'm just amazed in a way at Paul's ability and, can I use the word authority, or that these people listened to him, because Paul said, this young man has something he needs to tell the commander. And with that word, they brought the nephew to the commander, who told the commander everything about this vow and how the Jews were going to kill him. Now, it even gets more impressive to me, because when we go to verse 23, in verse 23, the length to which this commander goes to protect the Apostle Paul. Now, there could be, his motive could be to cover up his wrongdoing. Remember, he had bound the Apostle Paul, and he was a Roman citizen, and he had not been accused of any wrongdoing. So it could be fear of his getting in trouble. But I want you to just listen to the entourage that he assembles to escort the Apostle Paul from Jerusalem to Caesarea. This is in verse 23. Prepare 200 soldiers.
The Jews gonna get hungry.
Yeah. Not only that, 70 horsemen. Now that's a horse and a man. 70 of them. 200 spearmen. Am I right? My math is a little bit slow. 470 soldiers to escort one Jew from Jerusalem to Caesarea. I put a little map up there so you can kind of get a visual of that. That's incredible to think about. That, I mean, if they were sending me from here to Cummins Prison, I might get Barney Fife and a police car. 470 soldiers, and add the horses to that, to escort Paul to Caesarea. This, I think we can say safely, this was God's doing to make sure that Paul was not attacked along the road. That these 40 men, how much of a match would they be against 470 Roman soldiers? They wouldn't even try it. They wouldn't even attempt to get near the Apostle Paul. Now, this is where we can do some application on this. Look at slide number 8. How did Paul, this humbled former Pharisee turned preacher of the way, which the Jews called a sect, had no political connections as far as we know, how did he have such sway over the Romans? And it doesn't end here. There's just one example to give you some foreshadowing. When Paul got on the boat in Acts chapter 27 to transfer him from Caesarea to Rome, before that journey is over, he started as a prisoner, but before the journey was over, he was captain of the ship. Paul was an amazing man. And of course, this was God's doing, so we give him all the credit. Acts consistently shows how the Roman government protected Paul. They did so in Philippi. Well, when Paul said he was a Roman, Corinth, the proconsul dismissed his case. In Ephesus, The city officials went into that unlawful assembly and shut it down. So in one way, we give the Roman government a little credit for doing the right thing. Government is not always a bad thing. And then we read, starting in verse 26, all the way down to verse 30, that Commander Claudius Lysias, who was like the general, wrote a letter to Governor Felix explaining Paul's case and saying he needs to be judged or heard or tried in your court. And so the commander wrote a letter, sent it with the officials to explain to Felix why he needed to protect the Apostle Paul. So Paul's troubles, and even the church's troubles, were really not from Rome. They were from the Jews. If you compare the two, the Romans, pagans as they were, acted more justifiable than the Jews. And in the letter to, read it here, maybe it's another place, but that Christianity was not illegal in Rome. The Romans' view of religion, there was only one religion that they heavily enforced, and that was the worship of the Caesar. And particularly if you ever claimed any other to be king, then you would be in trouble with Rome. Otherwise, worship as you wish. Paul used his Roman citizenship to protect himself several times. You know what this says to us? That we have the rights to use our citizenship for our own protection. We should know the laws of our land, and we should use them lawfully for our own protection and well-being. That is not unbiblical. Now, if you give up your rights for the cause of Christ or for the cause of the gospel, then that is certainly good. But just understand. Know your tax laws and don't pay any more than you have to. Pay your taxes, but don't pay any more than you have to. When you are stopped by the police, know your rights. And don't allow the police to abuse you. Or any other city official or elected official. I'm glad that I live in a country like the United States of America where there are laws that protect me. Now, I'm glad we have the police force too, and I certainly don't want to defund them. Because I will take my chances with the police force every time over the criminals who, if there is no police force, what would stop them from coming to my house? And you say that 357 that you got would. But what would stop them from coming to my house and taking everything that I have? I have a 357. They get a bigger gun. Do we really want to go to that place? I don't think so. So anyway, off of that rant for a moment. So it is later. Paul is taken in verse 35 to Herod's Praetorium. Now you can look into that a little deeper and you find out that this is Herod's castle. Now I don't know if Paul was held in the dungeon or not, but it was, notice, well, somewhere. It's later when that Governor Felix allows Paul his freedom. He allows people to come and go, friends to come to him, and he had a lot of freedoms. Now, he was to stay put in one location, but he had a lot of freedoms to come and go, and he was not really, quote, in prison. He was just being held until a trial could be had. Now, chapter 24, Paul appears before Felix. So we're going to quickly run through this. So after 5 days, Ananias the high priest came down with the elders. So they came down from Jerusalem. Down does not always mean south. They came down from Jerusalem heading north to Caesarea. You always go down from Jerusalem. So they had an orator, we might call him the lawyer, and his name was Tertullus. And so he gave evidence against Paul. They told him that he was a person who caused all kinds of trouble. And verse 5, for we have found that this man, a plague, a creator of dissensions among all the Jews throughout the world, a ringleader of the sect called the Nazarenes, that cult that followed Jesus, who was a Nazarene. He even tried to profane the temple, and we seized him, but we would have took care of this matter. You would have not had to worry about this, Governor Felix. But Commander Lysias came, and with great violence. Who was violent? Do we need to go back and read the episode? Who was trying to pull Paul apart? Commander Lysias came in to restore the peace, not violence. Commanding his accusers to come to you by examining him yourself, you'll find out that everything that we accuse him of is true. And Paul, verse 10, after the governor had nodded to him to speak, answered, inasmuch as I know that you have been for many years a judge of this nation. So Felix was the governor of Judea, which is the region of Jerusalem and other places. I do more cheerfully answer for myself, because you may ascertain that it is no more than 12 days, so 12 days ago, that I went up to Jerusalem to worship. I was not in the temple disputing with anyone. I was not inciting a riot or any of that kind of thing in the synagogue, in the city, nowhere. No one can prove the things of which they now accuse me. But this I will confess to you, that according to the way which they call a sect, so I worship God of my fathers, believing all things which are written in the law and the prophets. We read that earlier. I have hope in God, which they themselves also accept, that there be a resurrection of the dead, both the just and the unjust. This being so, I myself always strive to have a conscience without offense toward God and men. Now, after many years, I came to bring alms and offerings to my own nation, or to my nation, and in the midst of which some Jews from Asia found me purified in the temple, neither with a mob nor with tumult. They ought to have been here before you to object if they had anything against me. Those Jews from Asia which started this whole riot in Jerusalem, they weren't there. Paul says they should be here to accuse me if they so think that I should be accused. Or else let those who are here themselves say that if they have found any wrongdoing in me while I stood before the council, remember he was there, Paul was trying to explain himself and caused this humongous argument. It wasn't Paul's fault that they didn't like each other and they wanted to argue about it. And the council found no guilt in the Apostle Paul. Unless it was this one statement that I made concerning the resurrection of the dead, I am being judged by you this day. That's the only thing that they had a problem with. And Paul knew that the Romans didn't care about that. They didn't care whether you believed in a resurrection or not. Resurrection, reincarnation, however you want to believe, that's fine with them. But when Felix heard these things, having more accurate knowledge of the way, listen to that. Felix, governor of Judea, knew about the way. He understood. This was such a huge movement. Churches being established, people being saved, all of this spread of Christianity all over his region. Felix knew what was going on. Well, what did he do? He adjourned the proceedings and said, when Lysias the commander comes down, I will make a decision on your case. So when Lysias comes, I get a chance to talk to him about it. I'll make a decision on your case. So he commanded the centurion to keep Paul and to let him, that's what I was looking for, and to let him have liberty, and told him not to forbid any of his friends to provide or to visit with him. Now after some days, a few days later, Felix with his wife Drusilla came. Oh, Drusilla was a Jew, by the way. They sent for Paul, and they wanted to hear about his faith in Christ. You didn't have to ask the Apostle Paul twice to share his faith, did you? And what does it say in verse 25? He reasoned about righteousness. I would guess that Paul talked about justification by faith in Jesus Christ alone. Self-control. How that after you are saved, you are to live your life of good works, which God has foreordained that we should walk in them. And judgment to come. If you reject Jesus Christ as your Savior, then you will be condemned to an eternal lake of fire. And I'm sure that Paul preached a good 3-point sermon like any good preacher should do. Judgment, self-control, righteousness, self-control, and judgment. 3-point sermon. You see, it's biblical. Felix was afraid, it says. This got under Felix's skin. The gospel, when preached, can affect the highest of the land or the lowest on Skid Row. The gospel is no respecter of persons, and when it is preached, it has the appropriate conviction to lead to salvation, to lead to living a life that pleases God, to lead to understanding judgment's coming and how you can avoid it. So Felix was afraid, and he answered. What a sad answer. Go away for now. When I have a convenient time, I will call for you. This is a passage that often, when I'm trying to share the gospel with someone and they're very resistant, they don't want to talk about it, I will turn to this passage, or I will refer to it, and I will say, there was a man one time that heard the gospel, he was convicted by it, and his answer was, go away for now. And when I have a convenient time, I'll call for you. And as far as I know, Felix is in hell because he never found a convenient time. Meanwhile, he also hoped that money would be given to him by Paul that he might be released. So it may not have been that he was as interested in the gospel as he first let on, and he was more interested in a bribe that seemingly, if Paul would have paid, he might have been let go. Why didn't he pay it? One, I don't have the answers, but I have guesses. One, Paul knew that bribery was a sin. And Paul was not going to do wrong in the hopes that it would turn out right. That's worth saying one more time. Paul was not willing to do wrong in the hopes that it would turn out right. We too can never do wrong, and hopefully it'll turn out right later. Secondly, Paul had been told he was going to Rome by the highest of authorities. God told him that. Paul was just waiting his time. He said, God's going to send me to Rome. I will put my hands in the hands of the Lord much more than I'll put my hands in the hands of a bribe. Therefore, he sent for him more often and conversed with him. But after 2 years, here's the 2-year mark, Felix was relieved of his duty, and Porcius Festus, took over. And Felix, wanting to do the Jews a favor, left Paul bound. Next couple of slides are some information on Felix. I read a book. It was, what's the name of that book? Oh, something like the Roman governmental leaders during the time of the first century. And I can't remember the title of it. But it basically gave you kind of a historical synopsis of all these people. And I would tell you, it read like, as I said, it read like watching an episode of Desperate Housewives. It's horrible. This guy killed that guy so he could have his wife. And this wife killed her husband so she could be free to marry this guy. And it was that kind of stuff that went on and on and on. And by the way, all these leaders were kin to one another in some fashion. The Herods and all of that. They were not good people. But it is amazing in the life of Paul that he had the privilege of preaching the gospel not only to Felix, but to more to come. We will see how he preaches the gospel to other Roman officials. And unfortunately, how they rejected him as well. Thank you for your time. Thank you for being here tonight. We're a small crowd, but I hope we got many that are online tonight. And I say to you who are watching online, thank you for tuning in and being a part of our Bible study. And we'll jump in and do a few announcements, and then I'll say goodbye to my online audience, and we'll have some prayer requests here tonight. So, big announcement. Get all of my sheets here. Hopefully everyone spread the news if you don't mind. I'll plan to put it out on our Facebook pages. But because of our high numbers in COVID, and with a few, well, I should say more cases in First Baptist Church than we have had since this all began. We have several, I don't want to say several, but a few. You know who they are. Within our church membership, only one that I know of was on campus. She did not know that she had COVID. She tested positive that afternoon, did not show and is really not showing any signs. So talk to me about that if you want to know more. But I've tried to alert the church about that, and we hope that it was a very minor spread, if it spread any. We've tried to be as careful as we could. I give the Lord the credit that we went back to mask. I didn't want to, but it was a good move. So we are going to not have Sunday school of all ages on campus. We are not having our teens, our children on campus on Wednesday nights. We will not have children's chapel or nursery during the worship service on Sundays. We are having the auditorium. I don't want to call it the adults because I would like for anybody to come that wishes. The auditorium Wednesday night Bible study as we are having right now. And we will continue to have that, Lord willing. We are having the Sunday morning worship service at 10:45 on Sundays. That will be the one service that we will have on campus. Now, we are also going to be offering the Sunday school, the adult Sunday school lesson on a video, as we have done in the past. Brother John Owen is going to do that for us this week. I plan to send that out on Friday, so you can have your Sunday school on Friday night or sometime on Saturday, and then you can come to worship services on Sunday. We ask that you wear your mask, and we will do our best to try to be socially distanced as best we can. Because it is proven that people can have the COVID virus without even knowing that they have it. And so that's something that I'm careful about, that I don't feel sick at all, and I have been vaccinated, but you can be a carrier and not even know. So we have to be a little careful with all of these numbers the way they are. And I really thank you for your participation. You are no more frustrated about it than I am. But that's what we have to do right now. We need to pray about this and ask the Lord to relieve us from this pandemic. So the rest of them, we will just pick up on Sunday. I don't have any other announcements to make. Do you have any other announcements that need to be made? Then I would say goodbye to our online audience. Thank you for being here. If you have a prayer concern, certainly send it our way. And we hope that everyone is getting the emails, text messages, one or both, because we are sending a lot of information out, prayer requests, and etc. on text messages and emails. If you are not, please let me know, and we will be sure to add you to our list that we send out. So just let me know that, and better said, write it down for me, and then I will make sure that Dee gets that on the list. So good night to our online audience, and at this point we'll turn our services to prayer request here.